The sun had barely risen over the rugged canyons of the American Southwest when John Harper, a young frontiersman, carefully made his way along a narrow trail. The landscape was both beautiful and unforgiving. Red rocks stretched into the sky, their surfaces jagged and sharp, while the desert below was dotted with hardy shrubs and cacti that seemed to grow right out of the stones. Birds of prey circled high above, their sharp eyes scanning for movement, as if they too were guardians of this wild and ancient land. John had traveled far from the settlements of the East, driven by a desire for adventure, curiosity about the land, and the hope of discovering new trade routes. But he knew, even as he marveled at the scenery, that the wilderness held dangers he could not always foresee. John's journey had begun weeks earlier. He had packed light, carrying only essentials: a bedroll, a small supply of dried food, a water flask, and a few tools. His horse, a sturdy brown mare named Willow, had carried him through narrow canyons and across dry riverbeds, often navigating paths so treacherous that John's hands ached from holding tight to the reins. Yet he welcomed the challenge. Every step deeper into the wilderness brought him closer to a world few outsiders ever saw, and he felt a thrill in walking where only the land and its original people had trodden for centuries. One morning, while descending a steep slope, John lost his footing. Rocks crumbled beneath him, and he tumbled down a short distance, scraping his arms and bruising his shoulder. He managed to stop himself against a large boulder, but in the process, he twisted his ankle badly. Pain shot through his leg, and he realized he could barely walk. He tried to call for help, but the canyon was silent except for the whisper of the wind through the rocks. Panic began to rise in him. The sun was climbing higher, and the desert heat promised to grow intense. If he did not find water or shelter soon, he could be in serious trouble. He forced himself to move slowly, limping along as best he could, looking for shade. Hours passed. His lips were dry, and his throat burned. He could see no sign of water or life. Only the endless red cliffs and sparse vegetation. Just as he began to despair, he noticed a shadow moving quickly among the rocks. At first, he thought it might be an animal, perhaps a coyote or a mountain lion. But then he realized it was a person, a woman, moving with incredible agility across the rugged terrain. She was young, her dark hair tied back neatly, and her clothing was simple, practical, and clearly made for survival in this harsh environment. The woman stopped a few feet away and looked at him with steady eyes. There was no fear in her gaze, only calm assessment. John tried to speak, but his voice was hoarse from thirst. The woman did not speak English, but she gestured for him to stay still. Slowly, she approached and produced a small gourd of water. She offered it to him with careful hands. John drank eagerly, grateful beyond words. The water soothed his parched throat and gave him enough strength to sit upright. The woman inspected his injuries. She seemed to understand the severity of his twisted ankle and the cuts on his arms. From a small pouch at her side, she pulled a mixture of herbs, grinding them with a smooth stone, and applied them to his wounds. The smell was strong, earthy, and unfamiliar. But within moments, he felt a comforting warmth as the herbal mixture stung lightly and then eased the pain. She worked with a quiet confidence, showing no rush, only careful attention. It was clear she had done this many times before. Over the next few hours, the woman guided John to a sheltered spot near a small creek, where the sun's heat was less intense. She gathered soft grasses to make a temporary resting place, and even broke small branches to create a crude splint for his ankle. John wanted to thank her, but he had no words she could understand. Instead, he nodded repeatedly and tried to smile, hoping she understood his gratitude. She seemed to recognize his attempts and offered a faint smile of her own. As the sun climbed higher, John realized how fortunate he was. Had he been alone, he might have struggled through the heat and the rugged landscape, or worse, the woman's timely appearance had saved him from a potentially life-threatening situation. As he rested, he observed her carefully. There was a strength in her movements, a knowledge of the land that was instinctual and precise. She moved as if she belonged to the rocks and the desert, at home in a world that was harsh and unforgiving. It was clear she had learned to survive in a way John could only admire. Over the next few days, as John recovered, the woman whose name he learned was Nava taught him how to move through the desert safely. She showed him how to find edible plants, how to identify the signs of water, and how to read the tracks of animals. John was fascinated. Every lesson was a glimpse into a way of life that was deeply connected to the land. He realized that his own knowledge, learned from books and travelers, was pale in comparison to her lived experience. Despite the language barrier, John and Nava began to communicate in gestures, expressions, and the shared understanding of survival. He learned to respect not only her skills but her wisdom, the way she understood the rhythms of nature and the unspoken rules of the land. She, in turn, seemed to assess him carefully, testing his patience, his determination, and his willingness to listen. Over time, a quiet trust grew between them. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the canyon walls, casting long shadows across the red rocks, John felt a strange sense of calm. He had been frightened, alone, and in pain, yet here he was, recovering, learning, and beginning to understand a world far different from the one he had known. He realized that his encounter with Nava was not a random event. Fate, chance, or something else had brought them together, and he felt both gratitude and a sense of awe at the timing of it all. Nava, for her part, seemed to carry an understanding of the sacred responsibility she held. She had saved his life, and in her culture, such acts were not merely gestures of kindness but carried weight and meaning. She did not speak of it directly yet, but there was an air of significance in her actions. A recognition that this was more than a simple rescue. John, unaware of the full implications, could only feel indebted to her, and increasingly aware of the deep wisdom in her ways. The days passed slowly, each one filled with lessons, care, and small acts of survival. John began to help Nava with chores, gathering firewood, fetching water, and assisting with the preparation of meals. It was humbling work for him, but he embraced it, seeing it as a way to repay the kindness that had saved his life. He also realized that the desert, though beautiful, demanded respect. Every mistake could be costly, every moment of carelessness dangerous. Nava's presence made it manageable, even enlightening. By the end of the first week, John could walk more steadily, though his ankle remained weak. He and Nava had formed a quiet bond. Words were few, but understanding was growing. He began to sense the deeper meaning behind her calm demeanor and skilled hands. She had saved him from immediate danger. Yes, but she had also opened a door into a world of knowledge, tradition, and human connection he had never known. And he knew, deep down, that this encounter would change his life forever. As the stars began to appear over the canyon, John sat beside the fire, watching Nava move gracefully as she prepared a simple meal. The flickering light highlighted her focused expression, her movements confident and precise. For the first time in his life, he felt completely out of his element, yet strangely at home. He understood that survival was more than food and water. It was knowledge, respect, and the quiet understanding of another person's world. He also knew, with a mixture of awe and apprehension, that this was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would challenge his beliefs, his understanding, and his very sense of identity. The desert around them was vast and ancient, filled with secrets and lessons. And now, thanks to Nava, John Harper was not only surviving, he was beginning to learn, to grow, and to see a world far beyond what he had ever imagined. Days turned into weeks, and John Harper's ankle slowly healed under Nava's careful attention. During this time, he had become accustomed to the rhythms of the desert and the routines of the Apache village. Every morning, he woke before the sun to the soft calls of birds and the quiet rustle of the wind through the canyon rocks. Nava was already awake, moving silently through the village, preparing food, gathering herbs, and checking the traps she had set the night before. Her skill in survival was astonishing, and John often found himself in awe of her confidence and ease in a world that had once seemed so harsh and dangerous. As John regained his strength, Nava began to show him more of her world. She took him to hidden waterholes, where fish darted beneath the surface and the water was so clear that he could see pebbles resting at the bottom. She taught him how to spot tracks in the sand and how to read the signs of approaching weather. A broken branch, a darkening cloud, the scent of sage on the wind, all were signals he was learning to understand. Slowly, John began to see the desert not as a place to be conquered, but as a living, breathing world, full of patterns and life. It was during one of these excursions that Nava spoke to him about her culture, though her words were few and careful. She explained, in gestures and short phrases, that every action had meaning, every choice carried responsibility, and that helping someone was not a casual act. In Apache tradition, saving a life was sacred, a duty that could create lifelong obligations. John listened carefully, realizing that what had seemed like simple kindness on her part was actually rooted in a deeply held moral and spiritual code. One afternoon, as the sun beat down relentlessly, Nava led John to a quiet spot overlooking a small valley. They sat together on a flat rock, and she gestured for him to pay attention. She drew symbols in the dirt with stick lines, circles, and patterns that seemed strange to him at first. Slowly, she began to explain, again through gestures and sounds, the sacred laws of her people. Life, she seemed to say, was a web of connections. Helping one person could create bonds that reached beyond individual desire, connecting families, generations, and the land itself. John nodded, trying to understand, though he felt the weight of the message even if he did not grasp every detail. He had grown up in a world of rules written on paper, laws enforced by governments and courts. The idea that saving someone could create an unspoken, binding responsibility was foreign and at first uncomfortable. Yet he could see the wisdom behind it. Every action had consequences, and the community depended on mutual respect, trust, and care for one another. It was that evening, as the sky turned golden with the setting sun, that Nava spoke the words that would change the course of John's life. Sitting across from him near the fire, she looked directly into his eyes and said, in her own language, which John slowly began to understand, "You rescued me, so now by sacred law I must bear you children." John's heart skipped a beat. The words were unexpected, heavy with meaning, and full of implications he had never considered. At first, he could barely respond. His mind raced, trying to understand what she was saying. Was this a demand? A promise? A law he could not ignore? He looked at her, unsure how to react. She watched him calmly, her eyes steady, giving him the space to absorb the gravity of her words. After a long moment, John realized that this was not a threat, but a declaration rooted in respect and tradition. Nava's words were not meant to frighten him, they were a statement of her duty. A responsibility that came from a culture much older than his own. She had saved him, and in her way, she was explaining the bond that now existed between them. John felt a mixture of awe, confusion, and respect. He had always considered himself independent, free to make his own choices. But here, he was being asked to accept a connection that was as spiritual as it was personal. Over the following days, John spoke with the elders of the village. Though he could not understand every word, he observed carefully and listened. The elders were wise and patient, explaining the laws of their people through gestures, stories, and repeated examples. They showed him that life in the desert was interconnected. No one survived alone. By helping one person, you helped the community, and by saving a life, you entered into a network of obligations and trust. John slowly began to see the beauty in this philosophy. It was not restrictive, but protective. It was a way of ensuring that every action mattered, and that the survival of individuals depended on the survival of the whole. Nava continued to teach John through daily life. She showed him how to track animals, how to prepare medicinal herbs, and how to make shelters from natural materials. Every lesson carried a hidden layer of cultural understanding. When she showed him how to tie knots for traps, she explained that each knot represented care and attention. When she prepared food, she spoke of sharing and the responsibility of ensuring everyone had enough. John began to internalize these lessons, realizing that the sacred law was not just a rule, but a guide for living in harmony with others and the land. As they spent more time together, John's admiration for Nava grew. She was patient, yet firm, gentle, yet strong. He saw how she cared for the village, how she respected the elders, and how she navigated the complex web of responsibilities that governed their lives. Her words about bearing children were not merely about family, they were about continuing a bond, ensuring survival, and honoring a way of life that had existed for generations. John felt a deep respect for her courage and wisdom. There were moments of struggle as well. John occasionally faltered, frustrated by the harshness of the desert, the unfamiliar customs, or his own limitations. Nava would guide him patiently, showing him that mistakes were part of learning, and that respect, attention, and perseverance were more valuable than immediate success. Slowly, John's confidence grew, and with it, a sense of belonging he had never felt before. He was no longer just a traveler passing through. He was becoming part of a community, bound by trust, mutual care, and shared experiences. One evening, as the firelight danced across the canyon walls, John and Nava sat quietly. The village had settled into rest, and only the sounds of the desert, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through the rocks filled the air. John reflected on the past weeks. He had been lost, injured, and alone, yet here he was, alive and learning in ways he had never imagined. He realized that Nava's words about sacred law were not a burden but a gift, a guide to living in connection with others and with the world. Nava, too, seemed to understand the weight of their connection. She had rescued him, yes, but she had also accepted the responsibility that came with her actions. Her eyes, steady and calm, showed neither fear nor uncertainty, only determination and quiet confidence. John understood, in that moment, that the bond she spoke of was real, and that it demanded respect, courage, and integrity. As the weeks passed, John's skills improved. He could hunt small game, gather edible plants, and navigate the desert with growing confidence. More importantly, he began to understand the deeper lessons Nava had taught him, lessons about respect, duty, and the interconnectedness of life. He no longer saw himself as an outsider. He was part of a story that stretched far beyond his own life, a story of survival, care, and shared responsibility. The bond between John and Nava grew stronger with each passing day. Though they did not yet speak the same language fluently, their actions communicated trust, respect, and mutual support. They worked together, laughed together, and shared the quiet moments of life in the desert. John felt a sense of peace he had never known, a feeling that he was exactly where he was meant to be, guided by a woman whose wisdom and courage had saved his life and now shaped his destiny. John began to see that the sacred law Nava spoke of was not about obligation alone, it was about connection, love, and the enduring power of trust. He realized that by accepting this bond, he was stepping into a world far richer and more meaningful than he had ever imagined. It was a world where actions mattered, where life was precious, and where every choice created ripples that extended far beyond the individual. By the time his ankle had fully healed, John Harper was no longer just a traveler or a frontiersman. He had become part of something larger, a story woven from courage, tradition, and respect. He understood the sacred law not as a burden, but as a path, a way to honor those who had helped him, to contribute to the community that had embraced him, and to live a life guided by wisdom far older than his own. John Harper's life had begun to change in ways he could never have imagined. No longer just a traveler passing through the desert, he had become part of Nava's world, part of the Apache village that had welcomed him when he was at his weakest. His days were filled with learning, working alongside Nava, and gradually becoming attuned to the rhythms of the land. Every sunrise brought new lessons: how to track deer through the canyon, how to gather edible roots and plants without harming the environment, and how to respect the delicate balance between humans and nature. Nava had become both his teacher and his guide. She showed him the ways of the village, introducing him to the elders, the hunters, and the women who cared for the children. John learned quickly that life in the village was not easy. Every task required focus, patience, and cooperation. The people depended on one another in ways John had never experienced in his previous life. Here, survival was a shared responsibility, and every action, no matter how small, could affect the community. Despite the challenges, John found a sense of purpose. He enjoyed the work, and he appreciated the way Nava treated him as more than just an outsider. She guided him patiently, correcting his mistakes without anger, praising his successes without arrogance. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, built on trust, respect, and shared experiences. Though they still struggled with language, their gestures, expressions, and simple words conveyed more meaning than John had thought possible. It was during a hunting expedition that John truly began to understand the depth of Nava's teachings. They were tracking a herd of deer through a narrow canyon when a sudden noise startled the animals. A rival group of hunters from a neighboring tribe had entered the area, and tension quickly rose. John froze, unsure how to respond. Nava, however, remained calm. She signaled for him to crouch, pointing to the rocks and the shadows. Following her guidance, John learned to move silently, to watch without being seen, and to anticipate danger before it arrived. By the time the rival hunters passed, John had gained not only confidence, but also a deeper appreciation for Nava's skill and wisdom. He realized that her calmness in the face of danger was not natural instinct alone, it was the result of years of experience and careful observation. He began to understand that survival in this world was as much about knowledge and awareness as it was about strength or bravery. Back in the village, John faced another challenge. A sudden storm had flooded the creek that supplied water to the settlement. The villagers worked tirelessly to protect their homes and livestock. John threw himself into the effort, helping to build barriers and carry water to those in need. Nava guided him, showing him the safest ways to move through the rising water and the best methods to reinforce the village's defenses. For the first time, John felt that he truly belonged. He was not just an observer or a guest, he was a contributor, a partner in the survival of the community. During these days of shared struggle, the bond between John and Nava deepened. They began to understand one another on a level beyond words. John noticed the small details, the way Nava's eyes would scan the horizon for changes, the way her hands moved with confidence and precision, the quiet way she cared for others. Nava, in turn, recognized John's determination, his willingness to learn, and his growing respect for her culture. Their shared experiences had created a foundation of trust and mutual respect, and slowly, affection began to develop. Yet life in the village was not without danger. Raiders from rival tribes sometimes threatened the settlement, and the wilderness itself posed constant challenges. One morning, as John and Nava were gathering firewood, a band of mounted raiders appeared on a distant ridge. Panic swept through the village, and the elders quickly organized a defense. John felt his heart race as he realized the seriousness of the situation. For the first time, he faced real combat, alongside people whose lives depended on his actions. Under Nava's guidance, John learned to move with purpose and caution. He helped reinforce barricades and guided villagers to safety. The raiders approached, but the villagers, united and prepared, managed to repel them without serious injury. John's efforts were recognized by the elders, and he felt a deep sense of pride. He had not only survived in this world, he had contributed to the safety and survival of others. The experience strengthened his connection to the village and to Nava, who had once again shown him the importance of courage, preparation, and trust. As the days passed, John's understanding of the sacred law grew. Nava's earlier words about bearing children as a responsibility of rescue took on new meaning. It was not just a personal commitment, it was part of a larger network of duties, respect, and connection. John realized that the law was not a burden, but a guiding principle that ensured survival, continuity, and harmony within the community. He began to see that his bond with Nava was both a personal and a cultural commitment, one that required patience, respect, and care. Their relationship blossomed naturally. They worked side by side, learning from one another, and sharing quiet moments of companionship. John admired Nava's strength and wisdom, while Nava appreciated John's determination and growing understanding of her ways. Though their love was still in its early stages, it was grounded in shared experiences, mutual respect, and the trials they had faced together. It was a love built on action and understanding, not just words or fleeting emotion. One evening, as the village settled under a sky full of stars, John reflected on how far he had come. He had entered the desert as a stranger, alone and unprepared, and had been transformed by his experiences, his challenges, and the guidance of Nava. He felt gratitude not only for his survival but for the opportunity to learn, grow, and become part of a community that valued life, respect, and duty above all else. Nava, too, felt the weight and beauty of their shared journey. She had rescued John, yes, but in doing so, she had also created a bond that would shape the future of the village and their lives. She saw in him the potential to honor the sacred law, to contribute to the well-being of the community, and to become a partner in the challenges and joys of life. The trust they had built was strong, and the foundation of their bond was unshakable. As winter approached, the village faced new challenges. Food became scarcer, and the cold nights tested everyone's endurance. John worked alongside Nava and the villagers, learning how to store food, build warm shelters, and care for the sick and elderly. Each task reinforced the lessons of survival, respect, and cooperation that Nava had been teaching him. John's presence, once an outsider, had become invaluable. He had earned the trust of the elders, the gratitude of the villagers, and the quiet admiration of Nava herself. The harshness of the environment, combined with the trials they faced, only strengthened their bond. John and Nava began to plan for the future, discussing, in gestures and simple words, how they would support one another and contribute to the village. The concept of sacred law, once abstract and difficult to understand, had become real in their daily lives. They knew that the responsibilities they shared would shape not only their own lives but also the lives of future generations. Through it all, John never lost sight of the lessons he had learned. Courage, patience, respect, and careful observation were the keys to survival, and the sacred law was a guide for living in harmony with others and with the land. He had come to understand that every action mattered, that every decision carried weight, and that the bonds formed through trust and care were as essential to life as food, water, and shelter. By the end of the season, John Harper was no longer just a visitor to the village. He had become a part of its rhythm, a contributor to its survival, and a partner to Nava in every sense. Their bond had grown through shared experiences, trials, and triumphs, and it had transformed them both. John had learned the meaning of sacred law in the deepest sense, not as an obligation, but as a pathway to connection, responsibility, and love. The story of John and Nava was no longer just about rescue or survival. It was about trust, understanding, and the power of shared experience to create bonds that could endure even the harshest challenges. Together, they faced dangers, learned lessons, and built a life rooted in respect and care. The desert, once a place of fear and uncertainty for John, had become a place of growth, learning, and belonging. As the stars shone brightly over the canyon, John and Nava sat side by side, quietly acknowledging the journey they had shared. They had faced trials, danger, and the unknown, and in doing so, had discovered the strength, courage, and love that would guide them into the future. The sacred law, which had once seemed daunting, had become a guiding light, illuminating the path of their lives together. And so, with the desert winds whispering through the canyon, John Harper understood the true meaning of survival, duty, and partnership. He had been rescued, and in being rescued, he had found not only safety but a connection that would shape the rest of his life. Nava had taught him that the laws of her people were not constraints but guides, and through them, he had discovered a love and a purpose that transcended words and crossed the boundaries of culture and tradition. The years that followed were filled with change, growth, and new beginnings for John Harper and Nava. What had started as an unexpected encounter in the desert had evolved into a deep, enduring bond. John had become an integral part of the Apache village, not just as a helper or student, but as a partner, husband, and father-to-be. Nava's earlier words about sacred law had shaped his understanding of responsibility, community, and love. He now understood that the law was not a burden, but a guiding principle that connected lives, families, and generations. Nava and John began preparing for the arrival of their first child. The village elders supported them, sharing advice and stories about the lives they had built within the community. John learned that the birth of a child was not only a family event but a communal celebration, one that honored both the individual and the continuation of traditions. He worked alongside Nava to create a safe and comfortable space for the newborn, gathering soft grasses, clean blankets, and dried herbs to ease labor and care for the mother. Each task reminded him of the sacred responsibilities he now shared and the deep trust that had been built between him and Nava. As the months passed, John and Nava continued their daily routines, balancing the care of the village with preparations for their growing family. John's skills had improved significantly. He could hunt, track, and navigate the desert with confidence. He also learned to respect the deeper rhythms of life in the village, observing how elders taught lessons to the young, how families supported one another, and how the land itself was honored through careful stewardship. Nava guided him patiently, always emphasizing the importance of humility, respect, and observation. The day finally came when Nava went into labor. John stayed by her side, holding her hand, offering words of encouragement, and following the instructions of the midwives. The village gathered quietly, providing support, singing traditional songs, and preparing herbal remedies. The air was filled with anticipation and hope. After several hours of effort, their first child, a healthy baby boy, was born. John held him gently, feeling the weight of responsibility and the immense joy of fatherhood. Nava rested beside him, her eyes shining with pride, relief, and love. Life with a newborn brought new challenges, but also new joys. John and Nava worked together to care for their child, learning the nuances of feeding, soothing, and nurturing. The villagers offered guidance, sharing wisdom passed down through generations. John marveled at the way Nava moved with grace and confidence, attending to the baby while also maintaining her other responsibilities. He realized that parenthood was a new layer of sacred duty, a continuation of the law that had first connected them. It was not only about raising a child, but about raising a child within a community, rooted in tradition, respect, and shared values. As their family grew, John and Nava welcomed more children. Each birth was celebrated by the village, reinforcing the bonds between families and the collective commitment to survival and care. John felt a sense of fulfillment he had never experienced before. The life he had once imagined, full of travel and adventure, had been transformed into something far richer. Adventure was still present, but now it was shared, grounded in love, responsibility, and the rhythms of the land. The children grew under the guidance of both parents and the wisdom of the elders. They learned to respect the land, understand the sacred laws, and honor the traditions of their people. John taught them tracking, hunting, and practical skills, while Nava instilled in them knowledge of herbs, community duties, and cultural customs. Their children represented the blending of two worlds, one rooted in Apache tradition, and the other shaped by John's experiences as an outsider. The village recognized them as a symbol of continuity and unity, a bridge between cultures that had once seemed separate. Despite the challenges of life in the desert, John and Nava found moments of joy and intimacy. They would walk together through the canyons, pointing out signs of animals, sharing stories, or simply enjoying the quiet beauty of the landscape. The bond that had begun with rescue had matured into deep friendship, trust, and love. Every challenge they faced, storms, scarcity of food, or the occasional threat from outsiders, was met together, strengthened by the foundation of respect and understanding they had built over the years. The village itself thrived under the combined efforts of its people. John contributed not only through physical labor, but also by sharing knowledge he had gained from the outside world. Always careful to respect the wisdom of the elders, Nava's role as a teacher and guide expanded, and she became a figure of inspiration for young women in the community. Together, They demonstrated the power of cooperation, cultural respect, and shared responsibility. Their story became an example of how lives could intersect and grow in harmony, even across different backgrounds. As their children grew older, John and Nava focused on preparing them for the challenges of life in the desert and within the community. They taught them the importance of observation, patience, and compassion. They shared stories of their own experiences, emphasizing the lessons learned from hardship, survival, and trust. John recalled the day he had been rescued by Nava and the sacred law that had guided their lives. He shared this story with the children, not as a tale of obligation, but as a lesson in respect, courage, and the profound connections that could shape a person's destiny. Years later, John Harper reflected on the journey that had brought him to this place. He had come to the desert seeking adventure, only to find a life far richer than he could have imagined. He had been lost, injured, and alone, but through Nava's courage and wisdom, he had been given not only survival but a purpose. The sacred law, which had first seemed overwhelming, had become a guiding principle, shaping a family, a community, and a way of life. Nava, too, saw the fruits of their journey. She had acted according to the sacred law, rescuing John and embracing the responsibilities that followed. In doing so, she had created a family grounded in respect, love, and cultural continuity. She saw their children thriving, their village prospering, and John fully integrated into a world that had once been foreign to him. The law she had honored was reflected in every moment of daily life, in the laughter of children, the work of the villagers, and the harmony of their shared existence. Their story became one remembered by the village for generations. Elders would tell the tale of the young frontiersman who had entered the desert as a stranger and had grown into a respected member of the community. They spoke of Nava's courage, wisdom, and adherence to sacred law, and of the bond that had shaped a family, influenced a village, and bridged two worlds. John and Nava's children carried forward this legacy, blending skills, knowledge, and traditions to navigate the challenges of life in the desert and beyond. Even as John aged, he remained deeply involved in the life of the village. He taught younger hunters, guided travelers who wandered into the territory, and continued to honor the lessons he had learned from Nava and the elders. Nava, strong and wise, continued to lead and guide the women and children, ensuring that the sacred laws and traditions were preserved. Together, they embodied the values that had once seemed so foreign to John: responsibility, respect, and the deep understanding that every action had meaning. Their children, grown and wise in their own right, carried forward the lessons of their parents. They knew the importance of trust, community, and the sacred bond that connected them to the land and to each other. John and Nava watched with pride as the next generation navigated the desert with skill, courage, and respect, honoring the principles that had guided their family for so many years. In the quiet moments, John and Nava would sit together beneath the stars, reflecting on the journey that had begun with an act of rescue. They remembered the days when John had been injured and helpless, when Nava had saved him and spoken of the sacred law. They understood now that the law was more than a rule. It was a living guide that had shaped lives, forged connections, and created a family and community that would endure for generations. Their story, though deeply personal, became a lesson for all who knew them. It was a story of courage, trust, and the enduring power of respect across cultures. It was a story of survival, yes, but also of love, partnership, and the bonds that shape human life in ways no one can anticipate. The sacred law had guided them through hardship and joy alike, transforming a chance encounter in the desert into a legacy that would last long after their time. John Harper, once a stranger in a vast and unforgiving land, had become a husband, father, and respected member of the Apache village. Nava, who had honored her sacred duty, had built a life rich with love, wisdom, and family. Together, they had created a legacy, one that blended cultures, preserved traditions, and demonstrated the profound power of human connection. As the sun set over the red rocks of the canyon, John and Nava stood side by side, watching their children play near the creek. The desert stretched endlessly before them, wild and untamed, yet full of life and possibility. They knew that the bond created by rescue, guided by sacred law, and nurtured through love and respect, would continue to shape their lives, their family, and their community for generations to come. In the quiet beauty of the desert, surrounded by their children and the people who had become their family, John and Nava found peace, fulfillment, and a sense of purpose that would endure forever.